And now let's explore the other side of the spectrum. Let's discuss why we do not need literary criticism. One fact that needs to be pointed out. Who was the main audience for said books? Well, I have the answer for you. These books, these mandatory books, they weren't written for the everyday people. These books, they were written for a certain audience. They were written for literary critics, elites, and people that we these days call snobs. Yes, one of the reasons a lot of people they struggle to read certain books, certain serious intellectual novels or whatever, one of the reasons they struggle is that these books were written for university intellectuals in mind. And such people, well, at least in the past, such people they have a certain view of literature. Oh, literature has to teach this, the literature has to comment on that. Anything that doesn't touch upon this important topic is juvenile, it's not worth reading, or whatever. In other words, you were meant to write books that touched upon this serious topic and make a correct commentary and no fun, because it's unacceptable. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this is where two writers come to my mind that were like, I am doing whatever I want. Two brilliant writers that cross my mind are J.R.R. Tolkien and Michael Ende. Yeah, Tolkien and Ende, they kinda prove why literary criticism, at least in its old form, is relevant and should not be relevant again. So, Tolkien and Ende, they wrote in a time where literature was supposed to be moralistic, it's supposed to touch serious topics or whatever. So, a lot of authors, they adhered to this. But them, Tolkien and Ende, they did not. They did not write books with a certain narrative in mind. And the best part is that they did not write books with the opposite narrative either. They did not go punk. Not exactly. Because if they did, they would have written absolutely punk rock style books, aka they deliberately opposed the popular narrative. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this is made me realize who was the target audience for both Tolkien and Ende. And the answer is people. Yes, critics, they hated both Tolkien and Ende because they wrote the so-called juvenile books. They did not comment on whatever issue was relevant at the time. They wrote whatever they wanted. At the same time, they did not go punk rock. They did not deliberately oppose things. Yes, this is where the we do not need literary criticism comes into play. Because critics, they claim that books should be written for them. Because even though times changed, the society changed, morals and values changed, the critics, they still think that all pieces of literature should be written for them in mind. Any book should adhere to some ideology, otherwise it's stupid and juvenile. Yes, you have to write correct stories to please a niche group. You know what, this kinda sounds like the Oscars these days. Long gone are those times where Lord of the Rings took all the awards, because everything has to be serious in order to be considered eligible for the Oscar. Yeah, remember when Return of the King got 11 Oscars? Well, forget about that. At least for now. Maybe in the future this is going to change. Well, in short, critics and intellectuals, they loved books written for them. And a lot of such books are a product of their time and a product of their ideology. And then you had Tolkien and Ende that wrote what they considered right. They wrote what they thought was supposed to be written, and they did not adhere to any ideology. Some people tried to insert a narrative onto their works, and I think that's the case to this day. However, this made me realize why a lot of intellectuals and critics and others, they hate fantasy. And it has nothing to do with fantasy being juvenile or for kids. Here's one fact about fantasy that a lot of people they cannot fathom, I think. You cannot find any other genre of literature that is more on the side of the freedom than fantasy. Because in fantasy there are a lot of what ifs. Oh, there's this concept that can be explored. Oh, I can think of this. Oh, this sounds cool. I can write about this. So you have various different genres, classics, contemporary, horror, sci-fi, you name it, and out of all genres of literature, fantasy is the one that has the most freedom. In short, intellectuals and elites and critics, they hate fantasy because fantasy is fundamentally on the side of creative freedom. And it's written for the people in mind. And I guess that creative freedom and having people as the audience in mind is a big no-no for the critics to this day. I do need to point out that snobs, they exist within fantasy fandom too. This isn't merely outside fantasy. However, this doesn't change the fact that fantasy is fundamentally about creative freedom and the commercial success or lack thereof has nothing to do with it. I hear a lot of attempts these days to apply any popular narrative not only to Tolkien but also to other fantasy writers, and such attempts are doomed to fail because these books are going to outlive any narrative. Now you probably ask me, what does this has to do with literary criticism and why we do not need literary criticism? The answer is this: we do not need snobs that hate everything that doesn't fit a narrative. Plain and simple. In short, literary criticism cannot exist in the old form. It cannot be snobbish, it cannot act like it's superior or whatever, because you cannot trash entire genres and call people dumb or uneducated. It doesn't work. If calling people names and looking down upon genres is considered literary criticism, then it shouldn't exist because that's not criticism. Okay, I do need to add a few words unrelated. Personally, I'm not a literary critic. I do not criticize. There are a few reasons for that. I need to have valid reasons to criticize an author's work. The author has to try really hard for me to criticize them, that's one thing. Yeah, I'm a pretty positive reader. I accept everything the author wrote, and if I do not accept it, I speak my mind. And luckily that happens rarely. Because I do not need to do that. And second, I'm also a writer myself and I'd rather write than criticize. And yeah, I'm also pretty soft-natured and I do not like criticizing that much. However, if I did criticize something, well, it's rare and it needed to be done. And also one thing about Tolkien and Ende is that they outlived their critics as authors. People still read their books. And the narratives and things like that, they are simply history now. And this is what people need to hear when they try to apply whatever narrative to works of fiction. Is that narratives, they change all the time. Narratives change and they become irrelevant. However, solid works of art, they stay. People are going to read them in years to come. So The Hobbit was published in 1937. Lord of the Rings in 1954 and 5. Mikhail Ende published Momo and The Neverending Story in 1973 and 79 respectively. And these books can be read at any point because they were done very well and they are basically timeless now. The critics, they said something about social commentary or whatever and faded into obscurity, and Tolkien and Ende as authors, they remained. Yes, that's all, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for watching. I thank you for listening to my controversial statements. In short, we do need literary criticism, but not in its old form, where there used to be two types of literature, the correct one and the incorrect one. This should be a thing of the past. And literary criticism should be about helping people understand the classic literature and other serious books instead of trashing people. Because when you trash people, call out their intelligence, that's not how you get them to read serious stuff. And before I finish, I want to add one thing. I heard it a lot from certain people, is that when you read classical literature, you learn to read critically, which is absolutely not true, at least in my case. You can read the classical literature and understand absolutely nothing. And on the other hand, you can read a social media post and analyze it. Yeah, this is why I absolutely disagree about that classic literature teaches you to think critically. Oh, I do not believe it. Any text can make you think critically. To be honest, A Song of Ice and Fire, in a matter of pages, made me think critically much more than the entire classical fiction that I read. Okay, I'm not going to dive deep into this topic because a lot of YouTubers have done it and I do not want to follow them. I'm just going to add that classic literature, it doesn't necessarily make you think critically, or at least it's not the only type of text that can make you think critically. And that's all. Let me know your opinions down in the comments. See you next time. Goodbye.